Oh. Ajnanaतिमिरान्धस्य ज्ञानाञ्जनशलाकया चक्षुरुन्मिलितं येन तस्मै श्रीगुरवे नमः। ॐ सहना भवतु सहनौ भुनक्तु सह वीर्यं करवावहै तेजस्विनावधीतमस्तु मा विद्विषावहै। ॐ शान्ति शान्ति शान्तिः। So first of all, I want to say thank you, especially to Ras Aran, for inviting me to be part of this series of sharings on the topic of personal development, becoming the best version of yourself. So I'm grateful that I'm able to share a little bit on this aspiration that we have to be the best that we can be. And it's always good to kind of explore a little bit, maybe the concepts regarding a topic like this. When we look at the title, the best version of oneself, then from how I look at it, there may be sort of two ways in which one could look at it. There may be more, but there's two ways in which I'm sort of thinking of it at the moment. Is the one is like a computer program which has different versions and keep upgrading to a new version. And we may sometimes think, yes, the latest version is not as good as the earlier version. And so I want to go back to the earlier version. So we may even feel that about ourselves sometimes, that the way I am now is not as wonderful or as good as I was a few years ago. So I would like to revert back to that me then. So it could be understood in that way. And the other way also I'm thinking of is that currently there are different versions of me. In a very simple, simplistic way, we could say maybe there's the Swami me, there's the son me, there's the friend me, there's the administrator me, there's the teacher me. This in terms of our social interactions. And then also there's like, you know, when one is maybe cheerful and one is in a bad mood, there seem to be different versions of the me, different aspects of one's personality. It is interesting to look at the word personality. Our Guru Swami Venkatashananda looked at it from this angle, that the word personality has its roots in the word persona. And the word persona really means mask. So what it really seems to indicate, though, when one looks at the word mask, that it is not the real me. So the question is, are these versions the real me, or are they different programs I'm using? These programs in Sanskrit are called samskara. The various programs embedded in our mind are called samskaras. It's a lovely word. If you look at it phonetically from an English speaking point of view, samskars. The idea being that in our mind, certain conditioning has taken place. These are called samskaras. These are the thought patterns that we have acquired or created over time, so that given certain situations, we react to that situation with a certain samskara, with a certain program, with a certain version of me. So if a particular situation arises, then a certain version of me, which is the samskara, that thought pattern that has been created in me, that reacts in this situation. Another situation, a different version of me, that is a different samskara, reacts. Amongst all these different samskaras that we have, and we are made up of so many samskaras, so much conditioning, there will be some that we may find this is a nice me, a nice version of me. And then we may find the other samskara is not such a nice version of me. And then we may have the wish, I would rather prefer to be operating in this, with this samskara, or with this version, with this thought pattern, rather than another thought pattern. And this is often, I think, how many approach the whole thing of a best version of me. But as I said, we should maybe question and look a little bit at this, because these samskaras, as we mentioned earlier on, they make up our personality. Even contradictory elements, we are also contradictory. Our samskaras contradict one another. It just depends on which samskara is more powerful at a particular moment, has got more energy in it at the moment, that particular samskara should act out. But the question is, are we these samskaras? Is that the real me? Or are these samskaras part of the personality, the mask? The mask, I'm not using the words mask in the sense that we are deliberately hiding our true self from others, although we may be doing that. But is the personality maybe something that hides the real me? So-called, maybe the real, not even a version of me, the real me. The samskaras, or the personality, or the different aspects of personality are all the different masks. One may be nicer than another. We may be able to improve on a particular mask, but they are masking or hiding the real me. So are we our personality at all? This question should arise. Am I any of the versions that I think I am? When we think of a version of me, we should realize that at that moment, we have a concept in our minds of what I wish to be. And that is a concept, which is nothing else other than a thought. And are we our thoughts? Or is thinking merely a process, an activity that happens in the mind, which really and truly is independent of who I really am? So when we think of a version of me, we are conceptualizing. And then that concept, if we hold on to that concept, then that concept becomes a samskara, becomes a personality. But is that the real me? Is a concept is something that is conceived, that is created, that did not exist before. It is new. Is that me? Or did I already exist, the real me already exist prior to the concept, prior to the thought of how I think I would like to be, or how I don't want to be? Because the best version of me is always in contrast to the worst version of me. Because that we're making a comparison between what is best in me and what is not so good in me. Which again highlights the problem. Are there so many me's? Or is there only one me, one real true me? This is the question. When we begin to contemplate in this manner, We may, and when I say contemplate, not just merely think about it, but look into ourselves. We may begin to realize that all these versions of me, the samskaras, the personality, the way we react, all of these are products of the mind, a product of thought. But we are not necessarily aware of who is the thinker. Who is the thinker of these thoughts? What creates these thoughts? Where do they come from? What creates a samskara? What creates the personality? What is the source of all this? This, the yogi or the spiritual seeker wants to investigate, look into, to come to the very root of it. So for that, we have to study the mind, we have to look into our mind, become aware of the mind, become aware of these samskaras. And when one does that, merely directly observing the mind, to be able to see the very source of thinking itself, we become aware, first of all, that we are not our thoughts, and we are not our samskaras, and we are not our personality. That all of these are the mask, of which we have different versions, that we are wearing, and that are covering the true self. Now, when that is realized, then the cover, these masks can be removed. Of course, inwardly, they're removed, they dissipate. And one can become aware of one's true essential nature, the true self, which is not even a version, because it has never undergone any change. That is what we call the soul, or consciousness. Pure consciousness is actually our true nature. That is the true self. We are that pure consciousness, which has never undergone any change in its essential nature. There are no different versions of consciousness. There is only consciousness, which in the yogic literature or Vedanta is called Atman. They call it Atman. That unchanging, unborn, in the sense it never had a birth because it always has existed, eternal self, which is pure existence, pure being, pure awareness, pure consciousness, and pure bliss. Not bliss, that bliss which is an opposite to unhappiness or pain or suffering. It is not something that is acquired through anything, but it is the fullness of our being. That bliss which is also love, which is wholeness, which is completeness, fulfillment, satisfaction. All of this one could put under the word bliss. Ananda is the Sanskrit word. Sat Chit Ananda is the very nature of the self. Sat means existence, being. Chit is consciousness, awareness, and Ananda is the bliss. And in that bliss, there's experience also of oneness with the whole of creation. There's no feeling of separateness. One has the experience of being one with the whole. So that is the true self. If we would like to say it is the best version of oneself, but not really in the sense of version, but it is that which is pristine, it is divine. And the yogi endeavors to discover that, or him or herself, is not really something that one discovers as you discover a treasure in the ground, which is an object. It is a totally different discovery. Discovery, our Guru Swami Venkateshananda to say, discover means to take the cover off. Discover. You take the cover off. So the veil that has hidden the true self, which is these masks, the personality, that has been removed. And then one is established. One could say established, one is realized and established in one's true self, which is the Satchidananda, pure being, pure consciousness, pure bliss. That consciousness shines through the personality. As long as there's this body-mind complex, there's still a personality, there's still a sense of I, ego, but it is illumined. And the whole personality, everything is illumined. And the whole being, which means this body-mind complex, the masks even, they are illumined in the sense that they are now governed by that consciousness. Whereas before, due to one's identification with the mind and the body, we have also identified with our personality, and therefore we get caught up in these different versions of oneself. Now, these different versions of oneself are no longer seen as versions of oneself. They are different aspects of personality, which is still there as long as the body-mind complex exists, that is prior to the death of this body. But they are now no longer governed by themselves or by the mind or ego. They are now governed by the Atman, by that consciousness, which by default is one with the whole of creation. And therefore, in every single situation that arises, it is that consciousness which brings the best, so to say, of oneself into a situation. It is not really a best of oneself. That action, that aspect of self that manifests as activity, thought and activity in any given situation is prompted then by that pure consciousness, therefore always appropriate, therefore always full of love, oneness. It could even be a chastising, but it will be a chastising of love, of appropriate, not something that the mind has calculated, not something that the me has thought of, but a spontaneous action that springs from that supreme consciousness, from that consciousness which is the self, the true self. When that is discovered, then one's whole life is a perfection. Not perfection necessarily in the sense as we perceive perfection to be or conceive of perfection to be. We have a concept again of perfection. It is that perfection which is nature, the cosmos. In the cosmos, there are all kinds of things happening. Some of them we may think are not perfect, but that's only from our limited point of view. From the infinite point of view, from the cosmic point of view, all of these, everything is perfection. The whole creation is perfection, because it has come from that perfection, which is that supreme consciousness of which we are part of. So therefore, there's perfection, a perfection which is of a spiritual nature, a divine nature. Here, there's no effort even to try and figure out how I should be, what version of myself I should present or become. Here, the perfection, which we may now translate into best version, but we can see it's not really, has nothing really to do with the me as a personality. It comes forth from the divine. And the whole of me becomes perfected in that sense. Effortlessly. It happens effortlessly. People who endeavored on this path of yoga, and I'm not using the word yoga in the limited sense as a tradition, but as the spiritual disciplines and principles that are universal, we will see that people who are endeavoring on this journey naturally become good, naturally become perfected in many, many aspects. Of course, most importantly, in their relationship to the world, how they interact with the world, but they don't no longer react to the world, because reaction is based on samskara, on the mask, on the personality. There's now action or response, which comes from the consciousness, that will be there. But very interestingly enough, also, we'll find that all those characteristics that we usually consider to be of value, the values, like compassion, like truthfulness, like non-violence, all of these will naturally arise in the yogi, in the one who's endeavoring to discover that pure self. Again, our Guru Swami Venkateshana pointed out that, for example, in the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, maybe some of you are familiar with this little scripture, which deals with the yoga of meditation. There are certain moral, ethical principles mentioned called yamas and niyamas, like non-violence, truthfulness, and so on, which usually are taught as disciplines. But actually, they are the natural state of one who's established in their pure consciousness, in their pure self. So that flowers and blossoms effortlessly as we begin to shed these samskaras, these different versions, and we become aware of our true self, then all these qualities arise. So there's perfection, effortlessly. And it's not based on a me opposed to somebody else as a unique thing. No, these are universal principles that belong to all beings. One becomes actually more of a universal person. Yet, at the same time, there's also uniqueness in that those sort of characteristics that pertain to this particular body-mind complex also become perfected. And that can even be in terms of abilities and capacities. And I want to take an example. I'm only talking about like Swami Venkateshananda and his Guru Swami Shivananda, because that is the tradition that I belong to, and therefore I'm familiar with these stories and what has happened. I'm not familiar with the other lineages so much, so I'm merely taking them as an example to show what I'm trying to share. So amongst Swami Shivananda's disciples, there were many who also attained or were on the path of this form of self-realization. And it's interesting to see how the different Swami, they were all Swamis, how they were very different in their talents and how they perfected their capabilities. I'll give you a few examples. One disciple was called Swami Krishnananda, and he was an amazing philosopher. He mastered all the philosophies of the East as well as of the West. When he gave lectures, he spoke like a book. It was actually like reading a book. The language, very high, the concepts very lofty, the flow of language, although it was not his language, speaking English, because he was of course Indian, was phenomenal. Then there's another one I'm thinking of, like Swami Vishnodevananda, who some of you may have heard of, because he was a very famous Hatha yogi. So the Hatha Yoga developed in him, and he was able to discover things that had been lost in the Hatha Yoga practices. Then there was the Swami, also Vidyananda, after whom I was actually named, who was an amazing musician. Another musician's disciple was Swami Nada Brahmananda, who actually had the capacity to raise the Kundalini. So what I'm trying to illustrate is that all are going towards the same self, that supreme consciousness, which is the same in everyone. But when that happens, then the latent capacities in a person also begin to flower, and they begin to be perfected. And they don't need to be any kind of extraordinary things. They can be ordinary things. There's a great Christian saint who was called Brother Lawrence. He was a dishwasher in the monastery, but an enlightened dishwasher. So his dishwashing was perfection. And the other monks and so on, used to love being in his presence because of the peace that he radiated. He was not a learned person. He was a very poor man when he joined. He was actually also crippled. But because he attained to this kind of state of being, then even the dishwashing was perfection. This is the beauty of the whole thing, that what we would call ordinary activities of life become perfected. And if one is meant to be the dishwasher, like Brother Lawrence, then that will be your perfection. That will be the best version of you on this level. But inwardly, you're not identified with the dishwasher. You're not identified with the lecture. You're not identified with the music thing. You are identifying yourself all the time with your true nature, which is the supreme consciousness. Then let that supreme consciousness determine what should be the best version of you. Then it is not determined by our concepts. There will be no tension even, because when we try to live up to concepts, is full of tension. Our journey will be full of tension because it's very difficult to even attain to anything as what we would conceptually think of ourselves to be or what we would want to be. Here, there's an effortless flowering, an effortless movement. All one need do is focus the attention on the center of one's being, which comes through introspection, which comes through meditation, which comes through reflection and studying one's mind. It's not study in an analytic way, but in a direct observational way. So directly observing one's mind will lead towards discovery of this true self. Then that true self, the true self, which is Satchidananda, the Atman, that pure consciousness, that expresses through this body-mind complex, making every moment perfection in itself, and also bringing out all that which is divine in us. And our daily activities are part of this divinity. Our talents, our capacities are part of this divine, of divinity. They're not separate, actually. So that all begins to flowers. And that is the best version that can be, because it is centered in that which is perfection, that which is divine. So thank you for allowing me to share these thoughts, and we pray that we will all be on this journey and attain this state of Satchidananda. I'd like to close with a Sanskrit prayer, which is Om Asatoma Satgamaya Tamasoma Jyotirgamaya Mrityorma Amritam Gamaya Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Lead us from the unreal to the real, from darkness to light, and from mortality to immortality. May there be threefold peace.